So Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Over to Tom.
Well, as Tom said, very, very warm welcome, particularly if you're joining us for the first time or here to consider this question, is Jesus history? It's great to be able to welcome you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us. My name is also Tom, as has been mentioned, and we're considering the question, is Jesus history? Let me begin by saying why I'm answering this question, what sort of prompted it in my mind recently. I'm from Yorkshire originally, and as it happened, I was up in Yorkshire and Leeds not long ago at a ministers' conference. And I was with a few sort of fellow ministers that I know quite well, and we were all wearing something rather similar. We were wearing jeans and woolly jumpers and collars, which is quite normal down here, but it felt less normal in city centre Leeds at 3 p.m. And we were walking to the station, aware that we all looked slightly similar, and a chap from Lancashire accosted us. And he said, "Art thou lost?" And I'm not sure he quite said thou, but you know, he asked us, "Are you lost?" We said, "Well, no, we're just looking for the station." He directed us towards the station. And then he took one look at us, all dressed the same, and said, "Art thou Jehovah's Witnesses?" And we said, "No, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses." But then get this, remember, we're all trainee ministers. He said, "Art thou trainee priests?" And I said, "Well, we don't call ourselves priests, but you basically guessed it." And I don't know how he did. Anyway, it must have been the fact we were all dressed the same. And he then, having discovered we're Christians, of course, proceeded to talk about a holiday he'd had to Kashmir with his friend, where, he said, he visited the tomb in which Jesus' body is buried, which was a surprise to me. And so we then engaged him in a conversation about the fact that we have gospel accounts saying that actually the tomb of Jesus is empty. And you can imagine how the conversation went on. He wanted to say, well, no, we can't trust any history. We can't trust history. It's written by man. And I think that's where we're at as a culture in lots of ways. We're very skeptical about history. And so I thought I would love to address that question of the historical evidence for Jesus. So that's what we're going to do today. Not just because it's an academic question, but because if Jesus is real, the Jesus we meet in the Gospels is real, then nothing could be more personally important for all of us, because Jesus says he can give us the forgiveness of sins. Jesus says that he can give us life beyond the grave. And if his grave is empty, as the gospel accounts say, then there is hope for us in a world of inflation and pandemics, in a world where we are, of course, dying. So this is of incredible importance. So let's consider it together. Is Jesus history? A couple of caveats before we get going. First thing to say is I am not an academic, full stop, but particularly in this field. I did apply to Cambridge, actually, but I spelt my middle name, Cecil, incorrectly on the application form. So you can imagine I didn't get in. You don't need to be an academic to consider this question. I hope you'll see that what we're looking at is very straightforward, really. The other thing to say is we will just scratch the surface of the subject today. We'll only just begin to answer the question. I won't mention a whole raft of other evidence, the fulfillment of prophecy, which paired with what we're considering today adds huge weight to the claims of Scripture, helps us to see that what the Gospels report is in fact rational and reasonable to expect in history because of prophecy and its fulfillment in the circumstances of Jesus' life. But we don't have time to touch on that. I won't touch on the accuracy of transmission from the original manuscript that was first written through to the very ancient and numerous manuscripts that we do have. I don't think there are any surviving ancient manuscripts of anything in terms of the originals. They're written on papyrus. But they were accurately preserved. There is good evidence for that. And if you want to explore questions like that, I'd point you to a talk. You'll see the QR code for it on the back of this piece of paper. And if you want to follow questions like that up and ask the question a bit more specifically, is the Bible trustworthy? Well, I wholeheartedly commend that talk to you. It's a really excellent talk, and it has a handout with it, which you can open through the other barcodes. So there's some caveats. Let's turn now to our question. Is Jesus history? I brought a visual aid in with me today. Here it is. It's a Roman coin. And on it are the letters LE, which mean the 5th reign of Nero, who was the Roman emperor at the time. It's a Judean Roman coin minted by the governor of Judea at that time. Remember, Judea was being occupied by the Roman emperor. And the governor of Judea was Porcius Festus. And in the 5th year of the emperor's reign, AD 58 or 59, this coin was minted by the governor of Judea. And if you'd like to have a look at it later, you can. And the point of bringing this coin in is just to remind us, I guess this is 1,963 years old, and it reminds us that the ancient past is as real and as solid, or once was as real and solid, as the lump of bronze that is in my hand right now. The works and the lives and the loves and the longings and the anxieties and the hopes of people in the ancient world, just as real as our own. In the ancient past, it is real. And so, as we consider this question, we are talking about reality. And this coin actually takes us to a moment in our ancient past, to the age of the apostles, to that time when the first followers of Jesus, the eyewitnesses of Jesus, were continuing to proclaim what they had done for decades and to record what they had done, what they'd been proclaiming, and indeed to seal their testimony with their own blood as martyrs, which they did. It's the year AD 58, 59, the early 60s AD, as the apostles were both writing down what they'd said and shedding their blood for what they'd said. And we can read these accounts. And we have 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're going to consider the introduction to one of those accounts written by Luke, which Tom read out for us. So you'll see there on the handout 3 observations which I'd like to make from the text printed at the top. This is the introduction to Luke's Gospel, and we'll see 3 things as we go. Firstly, we are going to see that what Luke is writing is already well-documented history. Secondly, that what he is writing is a record of eyewitness testimony. And then thirdly, that what he is writing has been carefully researched and is orderly. And just so you know, we'll spend most of our time on the second heading there. We're pretty sure Luke wrote this document, both from his own writings and first century letters. We can deduce that it was Luke, who was a physician, a medical doctor, who traveled with the Apostle Paul and wrote this down. And the way his second volume, this is volume 1, Luke's Gospel, volume 2 is Acts. The way the second volume ends, we can date the time of writing or beginning to finish off his writing in the early 60s AD. So that's Luke's Gospel. And as we look at this introduction, notice firstly that Luke is writing about well-documented history. Have a look with me, if you would, at verse 1. Luke says, just as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Just to say, that phrase, accomplished among us, that's Luke's sort of summary way of talking about Jesus' life and teaching. And Luke uses the word accomplished because as you look at Jesus' life and teaching, you see that it fits with ancient prophecy. And what Luke is saying is, as you study his life, you're going to see that he really has accomplished the salvation that God promised over centuries and millennia. But anyway, my point is to observe the fact that Luke says lots of people have already started recording what has happened among us. Many have undertaken to compile a narrative of these things. And my hunch is that probably he's referring to the other gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and John. And the point of saying others have also written this is to say what I'm writing now is not said in isolation. You can cross-examine what I'm saying, you can go away and scrutinize what I'm saying and see if it lines up. I have here my own witness statement. I had to stand in a court of law and give my testimony, having recorded my witness statement, after observing or witnessing a crime taking place. And I gave my testimony along with, I think, 3 other eyewitnesses. And I take it that as the jury cross-examined what we'd all said, they saw that there was authenticity in what we were saying, because we were saying the same thing. And that resulted in a life-changing sentence for one particular person. And Luke is saying you can do the same thing with his writing. Compare it to everything else we have from that time. Compare it to the other narratives which have been published among us. And you can see the consistency. You can see some differences as well, which are marks of authenticity, and we'll do that later on, actually. And we'll look at one example of that. So that's our first observation. Secondly, with a little bit more detail, let's consider the fact that Luke is saying his writing is recorded, written down, eyewitness testimony. So just like I gave my eyewitness testimony, he's writing the testimony of eyewitnesses. Verse 2. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Eyewitnesses refers to people who saw Jesus and followed him, saw his dead body, saw his risen body, and so on. And then the phrase ministers of the word refers specifically to the apostles. Jesus personally appointed them to testify to what they had seen, even at the expense of their own lives. And it probably refers also to people very close to him and close to the scene in the early church, like his brother, James. And we have an instance in Luke's writing of his own personal contact with the eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. In his second volume, Acts, in chapter 21, and verses 17 to 18. I won't read it, but you can go away and follow it up yourself. The author, who we take to be Luke, says that with Paul, the apostle, so there's one instance of his contact with an eyewitness of the risen Lord, but with Paul, he went to Jerusalem, where it all happened, and he met with James, Jesus' brother. And he spoke to these people. And he carefully wrote down what they had to say. He has had contact with the eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And as you read, I hope you'll take away Luke's gospel if you've never read it before and scrutinize it for yourself. And as you do get the sense that the information we're being given has come straight from those who were actually there at the time, in the place where it was all happening. And there are many marks of authenticity, knowledge of timings and politics and geography and people names and place names. And we don't have time to go into all of it, but I thought we might just consider people names and place names very briefly. So to begin with, as you read the Gospels generally, and Luke specifically, you see an abundance of people names, real people recorded with their names in the Gospels. And the fascinating thing is that the names that are recorded are incredibly accurate. They reflect the popular names of that time and that specific place. So as you read, for example, the list of the apostles in Luke chapter 6, you see that some people have the same name, like Tom and I have the same name. Tom is a very popular name, very fashionable these days. And back then, Simon was a very popular name, and so you get 2 Simons. Simon Peter, and then Simon the Zealot. So I don't know why he got that nickname, but they had to be differentiated. You know, they're popular names, and it's the same today. Here's a little survey, actually. Do we have any Cecils in the room? No, I didn't think we would do. It's a deeply unfashionable name at the moment. It's my middle name, but it's deeply unfashionable. It was my grandfather's name, and I think it was pretty unfashionable when it was his name anyway as well. But you get the idea. As time goes on, names change quite significantly in terms of what you commonly expect to find. And the same is so with geography. So Jewish names in Palestine, very different to Jewish names among the diaspora in Greco-Roman Egypt, where Eliezer and Sabaetus are the popular names. Do you see? So to get the names right, if you're not talking to the eyewitnesses, would be very difficult if you're writing at a distance of time or place. And yet what we find in Luke and the Gospels is incredible levels of accuracy. The great expert on all of this is a retired professor now in New Testament studies from the University of St Andrews. I said bishop because he was the Bishop Wardlaw Professor. I don't think that particularly impresses us, but anyway, he's a professor. And he says this: the percentages for men, that's their names, in the New Testament correlate remarkably closely with those for the population in general, so Palestine at the time of Jesus. Outside Palestine, the appropriate names simply could not have been chosen unless he'd been speaking to the eyewitnesses. And even within Palestine, so say it was 100 years later, and he's making it all up. He's in Palestine, but later down the line. But Borkham says it would be very surprising if random additions, accretions of names to this or that tradition would fit the actual pattern of names in the general population. In other words, to have this level of accuracy, Luke must have spoken to the eyewitnesses. And funnily enough, that's what he says he did. So that's people names. Very briefly, the same happens as you look at place names. Over the summer, I was reading Josephus. Josephus, an ancient eyewitness, non-Christian historian who wrote about the Jewish wars. And he is considered among scholars as an eyewitness of the events he describes because of the accuracy of his writing. And an example of that accuracy would be his accuracy with place names. But recent research has shown, Simon Gathercole has done this, that the level of accuracy that we find in Josephus is the same in the gospel accounts. It's the same in Luke's accounts. And there's a nice illustration of this. So people sometimes look to a discrepancy to try and discredit the gospels. They say in Luke chapter 9, Luke refers to a place called Bethsaida as a town or city. Whereas if you read Mark, he says it's a village. So, you know, who got it wrong? Well, as we read other ancient Jewish sources, like Josephus, we discover that the governor at the time of Jesus, the time being referred to by these accounts, that governor elevated Bethsaida from village to town. So they are both right. You could, at that specific time, you could have referred to it in either way as it went through a period of change. And that sort of discrepancy is, of course, in fact, a wonderful marker of authenticity. And there is great accuracy in the Gospels in Luke when it comes to names, be it people, be it places, and many other things. And the conclusion you come to as you read Luke's Gospel is that there's no way he could have written with this level of accuracy without having spoken to the eyewitnesses. Well, we don't really have time for our third point, but you will find if you read Luke's Gospel that it is very, very carefully researched and that it's orderly. It makes sense. As you read accounts that were written 100 or hundreds of years later by people making it up, you find the opposite. Doesn't make sense. So with place names and people names, there are hardly any, and when they do have them, they're inaccurate. There's an example where we're told in one of the Gnostic Gospels that Jesus sailed across the sea to Nazareth, which is inland, and this kind of thing. But with Luke, careful research, orderly. And I'd love you to go away and read it, and I'm sure you will come to that conclusion. That's what you'll find. But I think the point of saying what he says in verse 3, so have a look at verse 3. He says, "It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus." I think the reason he's saying it's orderly and carefully researched is to say this to his reader. Will you please read this? I've gone to great trouble to ensure that you have something comprehensive in front of you, that you have the facts, that you have the truth to research for yourself. So please read it. Well, let me make just a concluding remark before we draw our time to a close. I hope we have seen that there is immense historical evidence for the reality of Jesus Christ, the Jesus we meet with in the gospel accounts, paired with the fulfillment of prophecy, which is another talk in itself. I am totally persuaded that the Jesus of the Gospels is real. And of course, that has great significance for us. And it has personal significance. So just look again at verse 3. And do you notice, Luke is writing to a real person. Do you remember, I mentioned this coin minted by Porcius Festus, the governor in Judea at that time. Well, if you go away and read Luke's second account, Acts, we find the Apostle Paul with Luke stood before the governor that minted this coin. And the governor says to Paul, "Paul, you're crazy." Paul's talking about resurrection. He says, "Paul, you're out of your mind. From your great learning, you're out of your mind." And Paul says to him, he addresses him as you would someone important in the Roman Empire, "Most excellent Festus, I am not out of my mind. I'm speaking plain and rational words." And then he refers to what he'd seen and to prophecy. And Luke calls his reader most excellent Theophilus. He wasn't clearly the governor. He clearly wasn't the governor at the time, but I suspect he was someone very important in the Roman Empire. And who knows, maybe he was there as Paul addressed most excellent Festus. Most excellent Theophilus was listening in and hearing this talk of resurrection and life from the dead and fulfillment of prophecy and salvation. And he thought, what? Could this be true for me? And perhaps Luke got to chat to him. I don't know. But Luke wants this real person with real questions and real concerns, like all of us, in a world of, rising bread prices and inflation and uncertain futures and all the rest of it. Luke writes to him knowing that he has questions and wanting to help him be certain about the things he's been hearing of Jesus. And that's what Luke says in verse 4, isn't it? Just glance at verse 4 as we close. Luke says, "I'm writing these things that you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught." What you've heard, what you've picked up, I want you now to be certain for yourself, to investigate the evidence and to be certain. To be certain about this Jesus who says he came into our world to accomplish God's salvation and then demonstrated it. He said he was going to the cross for a deliberate reason, to carry my sin and the sin of all who believe in him and the judgment it deserves, and to secure peace with God for those who look to him. Huge, huge significance. And Luke wants this real person to take hold of the salvation of God for himself personally. And so he writes to him and said, "Well, will you read the eyewitness testimony?" So I'd love you to do that. Do take a Luke's Gospel away if you'd like to and read it. If you have questions, you want to follow any of what I've said up with me, do grab me. I'd love to answer your questions, but I'm going to hand back now to Tom.